Not terrible. I injured it in a way that there's not much they can do to fix it. Just gotta let it heal, so. Well, tonight we are looking at the second half of Mark chapter 6. Just to kind of recap what we looked at last week, we started off with the first half of Mark, where Jesus talks about a prophet having no honor in their hometown. We had Jesus sending out the 12, sending them out 2 by 2. And then we had the longer discourse here in the middle of the chapter where Mark tells the story of John the Baptist beheaded. So that's kind of the context of where we've been at. And we can even go back to the very end of chapter 5, because this is still kind of ongoing. You know, Mark kind of implies this just kind of keeps compiling and building upon itself. And at the end of Mark chapter 5, we have Jesus bringing Jairus' daughter back to life. And so that's the context we find ourselves in tonight as we prepare to start at Mark chapter 6, verse 30. This pericope is Mark's version of the feeding of the 5,000, which goes through verse 44. So like I've been doing through the Gospels, we'll read the whole pericope and then we'll go back and we'll take it paragraph by paragraph. So with that, I'll be reading Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit in groups on the grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. So that's the whole story. I'm going to go back and read the first paragraph, but I want to remind us of our 3 questions. What do you notice? What questions does that make you ask? And what's the significance of the reality this paints? So, first paragraph, 30 and 31. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So what do you notice?
Must have been some level of organization about the people approaching. They were both coming and going, not just coming.
Coming and going, there's a lot of commotion here. And just to clarify, this is picking back up from verses the second half of verse 6 through verse 13, where Jesus had sent them out to, do the ministry and cast out the evil spirits. What else do you notice?
Every parent had a story and everyone wanted to get Jesus there.
Oh, you at least had 6 different sets of stories, right? Because there were 12 of them, and they were sent out 2 at a time, so that takes a while for all of them to report. And apparently, like you're saying, there's so many other people there that they're getting interrupted and they can't even give their reports to Jesus without the crowd kind of breaking in. Anything else?
I think Jesus recognizes the need to just get away.
Yeah, there's this need to kind of get away and debrief and for him to just reconnect to his disciples.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're.
And yeah, they're needed. He said,
He reminded me of the phrases that he had compassion on them, although that wasn't in this particular paragraph.
Jesus is showing a familial compassion. He is familiar with them, he knows them, he can see them, he says, he notices they haven't even had a chance to eat. It's interesting, I don't know that Matthew and Luke or John paint that picture, but in Mark's gospel, the feeding of the 5,000 starts with the hunger and depletedness of the disciples. Isn't that different? That paints I don't know how that makes this different, but I had never noticed that until actually earlier this week as we're preparing for a sermon in Lent. Daniel brought out that particular point. In Mark's gospel, the feeding of the 5,000 it begins with the disciples. It doesn't begin with the people. Robert, I know you've been your Sunday school teacher for a number of years. In April, you lead our kids men right now, and all of you guys at different times have led different things. There is both a level of joy that comes from leading something, but a level of exhaustion that you just don't get from just participating. Leading it just brings something different about things. And I appreciate the fact that Mark gives us a story here that starts with that reality. Anything else you notice? Then let's read the next paragraph. 32 through 34. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. You almost just stop there, right? So they went away. Jesus is trying to care for his disciples, right? They went away by themselves. Jesus leaves the crowd with all their needs. And in a boat, it feels like, have they ever left the boats? It just feels like the boats are a constant backdrop, doesn't it? And then to a solitary place. They're going to a place that they know should be solitary. Let's rephrase that. 33 and 34. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. I got the picture the first time I read this tonight. Most of you guys know that we're dog people. We've got 2 dogs. And when they were puppies, if they saw you or heard your voice, they would come looking for you. And you almost get the picture of the crowd going along the lake like little puppies, following along, just trying to get close to the master. And here it does say those words again. He had compassion on them.
Yeah.
What else do you notice?
Well, they knew him well enough to know where he's headed.
Yeah, so this deserted place
Yeah,
is a place that he frequented enough that they knew it. And they knew where he was going and they knew how to get there. And the place of retreat and rest is a place of ministry.
now, I don't know how far away it was from where they were at, but you would think that getting there in the boat would be a little quicker, so. To me, it is almost like Jesus was taking his sweet time getting there because he knew that was the only rest that those disciples were gonna get.
Ooh,
Good insight.
I mean, that's just a thought, you know, I mean,
that maybe it wasn't so much the location where they would find rest, but it was the journey of them in the boat. This distraction work. You know, it's kind of like this last weekend. I didn't realize just how much I needed rest until I got sick, and then I slept for most of 3 days. Who would ever think that sailing a boat would be resting?
well, if you've been on a boat for any amount of time, it can be pretty rough. I slept on a boat for 3.5 years, so.
Well, under the right circumstances, I'm pretty sure when you were on that boat for 3.5 years, though, that was not a rest.
No, well, I slept pretty good when I was sleeping because I worked really hard. I mean, for me, it was, I just like the water. So.
I remember when we first went to Mount Etna Church. And they had their first dinner. They did this pork chop dinner where they would raise money for missions. I'm pretty sure what it was for. And I thought, you know, I just want to be one of them. And I just want to work alongside them. And I went and I started washing dishes. And they kicked me out of the kitchen. They said, no, you're the pastor. You need to be out there talking to people. But there was something about just being beside them, washing dishes with them, that actually was relaxing. You know, sometimes it's those menial, regular, everyday tasks that even though you're working, there's also a sense in which it can be rest. That's a good point, Kevin. What else do you notice in this paragraph?
They were hungry for more.
Yeah, the people were starving. And not just for food. They were starving for spiritual food. They were starving for real leadership.
They came from different cities. And they were united in one thing, they wanted to see Jesus. Kind of contradictory, kind of how our churches are. Yeah, I mean, this is it didn't matter where they came from, they were all there united to see Jesus.
Speckled, spotted, striped, doesn't matter what kind of sheep they were. They were one flock for Christ.
Yeah.
And he uses that kind of language, doesn't he? He says they're like sheep without a shepherd.
And I think he could see that even though they came from different backgrounds, that they are the same flock. And what they needed was a shepherd to bring them together, you know? And the common binding was his teaching, you know what I'm saying?
Well, the point of, you know, for the most part, sheep will take care of themselves. So long as you put them in the right field, they'll eat the grass that they need to eat. They'll drink the water that's right there in front of them. They'll kind of care for themselves. The shepherd's job is to make sure to move them to where they need to be. And then to protect them from the enemies, the lions, the bears, the, you know, the thieves, the bandits, the wolves, the things that would attack them. And so it's interesting that Jesus says that they're like sheep without a shepherd, and you point out that they come from all of these different towns. There was no shepherd that would gather them together, and they are all following Jesus because they know he is the good shepherd that will lead them where they need to go. It really kind of accentuates, when I was studying this earlier this week, we were talking more about the reality of how Jesus is the last prophet. Not that there aren't other prophets, and there are prophets today. There are people who bring forth God's word prophetically today. But that in the time leading up to Christ, the true people who followed God, the true people who led the body in following God, almost all of them had gone away. You know, and right before this section, we get the story of the beheading of John the Baptist, which Jesus says was a prophet of God that they killed. And so there's this reality. I think Mark is putting these two stories together on purpose, because you have this notion of the beheading of John, and now you have all these people that are like sheep without a shepherd. So even though Jesus's goal for this trip was to care for his disciples, that was his goal, right? So Mark writes this story. He sees that there's all these sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah, I was gonna comment on that, that word "so" is pretty significant. You know, he saw their sheep without a shepherd, so he began teaching. He was living in response to the situation in front of him, that he knew he could do something about.
It makes me wonder too, and I haven't looked at the Greek on this. I wonder if he's teaching the sheep so much as he's teaching the disciples how to be shepherds. Because this trip is really about the disciples, which is moderately annoying. I'm gonna ask Kevin to weigh in on this a little bit. There are times when as a leader, you just want to be done. You need to clock out. You needed to clock out like 5 hours ago. And there's nothing left in the tank, and you just want to go home and crawl into bed and maybe wake up tomorrow. And isn't that when the phone rings?
Yeah.
And there's a new emergency. You almost get that picture. I mean, the disciples had gone. They were telling these wonderful stories of everything that had happened about, you know, casting out demons and healing the sick and doing the things Jesus had done. And there could probably even be a point here where, how do you think the disciples felt? Here they are coming back to report to the master. And now he's distracted by the people.
Yeah.
So that's why I asked that question. Is he teaching the sheep? Or is he maybe teaching the disciples how to care for the sheep?
It would seem that it would be by example, because the whole section 34, verse 34, doesn't mention the disciples. It's all about the crowd. But I agree with you. I don't think, you know, Jesus was the kind of person who never did anything for one reason, probably. He always seemed to have, this is the immediate thing that you're seeing, but this is the deeper implication. And those of you that follow me, I want you to be picking up that one too.
Mark in particular always seems to show that everything Jesus does has layers to it. There is the surface level meaning, and that is good. There's that next level down meaning, and that's wow. And then you just keep digging, and there are layers beyond that of meaning to it. Mark presents us with an extremely complex, very particular, very pointed Jesus. Jesus doesn't do anything haphazard. So just like what you were saying, maybe them getting in the boat, Jesus knew he wasn't getting away from the crowds, but to get in the boat was to give just a little bit of respite. Let's take halftime. You know, we're gonna run to the locker room. We're gonna debrief for just a little bit, and we're gonna run back out, stretch, and get ready for the second half.
You may have told them to do some lazy eights while we're out. You know, who knows? It was long enough for the people to watch from the shore and to gather the crowds.
It was definitely long enough for the people to watch. Definitely long enough that the people knew where they were going. And definitely long enough for them to gather a crowd from other places to come together. Anything else you notice in 30 through 34?
I think it's just the fact that Jesus, even though he was trying to get away from him, just could not. He just really loved it. He really had compassion for it. He was willing to kind of deviate from his plan to meet the needs of the people.
You know, it's kind of like for Melissa and I watching our kids with our grandkids. On the one hand, they are just exhausting. But then they smile at you, and you're like, okay, yeah, one more time. You know. And you get the sense that Jesus looks at us that way. On the one hand, I'm certain he looks at Samuel and he's like, dear Lord, is he gonna ever get this?
No.
Exactly, facepalm moment. Ugh. But then he says, but he's mine.
There was one other thing I noticed. I don't know if there's any significance to it or it's just the way it's written. It almost seems like in the first sentence or the first phrasing of 34, that Jesus was somewhat unaware how big the crowd was, or that there was a crowd there. Maybe they were on the other side of some waterfront buildings or something like that. Because it says, when he landed and saw a crowd, he had compassion.
Well, it had to be a bigger crowd than what he left.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, so he left this crowd over here and he's leaving them because there's so many of them, and he gets over here and he gets out of the boat and goes out and goes, whoa, where'd all these people, I mean, it's with me, where'd all these people come from, you know? I mean, I don't think he was expecting to see all those people.
Yeah, it almost looks like it was a little bit of a surprise. But then, how does somebody who's been in a position of being unconstrained by time in any way, shape, or form, get surprised by anything?
so in verse 34 or 31, the number implies many. In verse 34, it's large. So Kevin's notion is there were many people, enough to where Jesus felt like, let's get away, let's rest a second. And then in 34, the Greek says, and having gotten out of the boat, he saw the large crowd. So, well, stepping away did not diminish the need. If anything, it just made the need greater. Anything else? You know, maybe, I was gonna move on, but how often is that the case? You have a big problem, you're like, it's too big, let's just take a step back and regroup. And you come back and the problem is worse. It almost would have been better if you just dealt with it when it was there in front of you. And maybe it might not have gotten as big of a deal. Just saying.
Now, I was looking at some of the cross references to the sheep without a shepherd. And there's quite a few Old Testament passages that talk about Israel being like a sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah,
Kind of like that, the condition that they just have. I mean, it's something that they deal with all the time, you know?
you know, in our world today, there's this, you know, notion of online dating and the dating apps and things like that. You know, you get to swipe right and choose the ones you want to look at. Israel was notorious for choosing bad shepherds.
Yeah.
Just over and over again, they've notoriously chose bad shepherds. Like you said, all throughout the Old Testament, that phraseology is there. God oftentimes looks down at his people and he has compassion on them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. Now, to a certain degree, you'd think they'd learn their lesson. But the other side of that is, do sheep really get to choose who their shepherd is?
And one thing about sheep is they get lost pretty easy. That's a fact. I mean, Philip Keller, I don't know if you ever read his book. Wrote a great book about Psalm 23 and shepherds look at Psalm 23. And he points out that, you know, people tend to lose direction pretty easily if they aren't careful, if they aren't focused on what they need to be focused on, if they're not following what they need to follow. It's really easy to get off the path and end up in a problem, you know?
I had the thought, you know, our world might want to claim that ADD is a new thing. The Israelite people, they had it bad. They got distracted time and time again.
Seems like they'd be good for a while and then all of a sudden something new would come in and they go, oh, that looks good. And they start following it, you know?
It's just like, wait a second, you were just going the wrong direction. Why? Because it's this. But that makes no sense, but it's that. They follow for a little while and realize it's not all that great. Maybe they turn back to Jesus and Yahweh, or maybe they go on to something else, you know, they just.
Well, the biggest problem that God had with the Israelites in the wilderness was that they kept turning back toward Jesus, like it was a good place to go to, you know? He's like, why are you turning back to the place where you're gonna bond it, you know what?
No, but I think why is because it's what they were used to. New things are new things, you know how you can be when you are used to doing things one way. They may not have been the greatest, but yet,
You know how it works,
yes,
and we're so like that. Sin is comfortable. It's not good. It's not good for us, and we know that, but it's comfortable. Which is why Jesus sees these people, sees them in their need, has compassion on them, and he begins to teach them in things. Let's read our next.
You ever wonder why he taught them at that time? I mean, like, well, what would be the message of the day? It'd be nice to know what those sermons were at that time.
The immediate thought I had as you said that, Kevin. Second verse is same as the first.
Yeah.
But it's not, I'm Henry VIII, I am.
No.
I was thinking that.
Let's read our next paragraphs, 35 and 36.
That right?
Yeah.
By this time, it was late in the day, So his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. What do you notice? One of the things I appreciate about Mark's version of this story, in the other versions, I could give the disciples a hard time. They're like, why, it made me wonder, why are they so concerned about food?
Maybe they were hungry.
But in Mark's gospel, we're told that
Yeah.
they've come to report to Jesus and they haven't had a chance to eat. And so Jesus says, let's get away. And they come to their desolate place, their place of rest, where they can retreat and refuel and eat and tell Jesus their reports. And the moment they get there, and there's more work to be done. So in Mark's gospel, they're bringing this to Jesus actually isn't so much of a critique. It's just more painting a reality,
Yeah,
which I really appreciate that, because in the other gospels, I just want to smack the disciples around. Guys, why didn't you think about this earlier in the day, you know? What else do you notice?
Well, we're allowed to take bags, so we couldn't bring any with them.
Yeah, they didn't take anything with them,
Yeah, so.
so they didn't
Wasn't
even
that
have any.
one of the things that he said,
Smack them run.
grab nothing and follow me?
Exactly, you know, so when he sent them out back at the beginning of chapter 6, he told them to take no bag, take no money, eat what you were given there, and just receive what you're given. So for them to now be bringing up food again, really is not out of ordinary. In fact, it's very legitimate.
Sam, at this point in time, you would think the disciples would know better than to say, send the people away. They've been with him long enough to know that he's not going to send them away until they're dealt with.
well, I don't know, it's kind of a good idea. You don't have nothing to feed them. They're not thinking spiritual here, they're thinking, like you said, reality. There's nothing here. You need to send them somewhere where they can find food.
On the one hand, the pure plain reality is what they're trying to deal with. But Dennis's point is true. Mark has been building a case that Jesus is not going to send people away. I mean, remember the previous chapter, right? We had the story of Jairus. He's following Jairus to his house, and he gets distracted by the woman with bleeding. Now he regains his, after the side quest with the woman with the bleeding disorder, he goes and he heals the daughter. He never stops caring for what's right in front of him. And he doesn't send people away until he's done it.
But I don't think he's done with the disciples here. It's not so much as he's done with the.
No,
Here's another chance to teach the disciples to have faith, you know?
could it be that in Mark's telling of this story, the feeding of the 5,000 is beside them? It's that thing we were just saying, even the notion of seeing them like sheep without a shepherd and what he taught, on the one hand, you want to know, what did he teach them? Is this just second verse same as the first? Does he teach them something new? If it was something new, you'd think that Mark would have wrote that down, but he doesn't write down what he taught. So is this about the problem in front of them? Or is this more about Jesus showing his disciples what the kingdom of God is meant to be like?
Because when they go to them, they're not even thinking about asking Jesus, what is there something we can do? They're just trying to push the problem away.
They are managing the problem in front of them, and they're not trying to figure out, what Jesus might have in store.
But he came for.
Any other thoughts?
But just. I mean, one thing that, what Dave said, his disciples said implies. Is even though that place was desolate, it was still walking distance. From places to get things done.
This was. This was a campground just outside of town, about a mile and a half or so. You can still get to town. You can go to Wendy's and get you a burger, you can go to McDonald's and get you a burger, but we're not in a place where there's a convenience store right now. It's desolate, but it's still close enough. And it's close enough to things that are partial solutions. But not a full solution.
Well, I think that's real key when he's trying to train them to think spiritually. You know, it's just one more example about the way that you're thinking, not being of the eternal, not being which it's so important for all these people. Just doesn't quite cut it. You've got an opportunity you really need to take it.
The thing of it is our tendency to look for solutions. Are almost always only going to be partial solutions.
And it's an assumption that they have nothing to eat because it turns out that they do.
Yeah, there's this assumption that they have nothing to eat, but they do have something. Now, it might be the very same something that they left the other side of the lake with. And they have intended for themselves to eat, that they still haven't gotten a chance to do because they rode their way here. And then they dealt with the people. So, verse 37. But he answered, you give them something to eat. They said to him, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? First of all, I want to know who's the one that's so good with math that they could quickly calculate there's 1 month's wages, there's two. Dear Lord, Jesus, are you sure there's probably half a year's wages?
Probably Matthew, the tax collector.
Yeah.
Matthew, the tax.
Based on the chosen, yeah. You probably had to figure it out.
He didn't know how to add and subtract, but I mean, I think it's like, it's almost like a broad statement, you know, you're going. It's not an actual amount, but they're just going like half a year's wages is a, rather than saying the exact amount, it's gonna take a half a year's wages, right? I mean, in the New King James, it actually gives a, it says, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread? And give them something to eat, like somebody knew how much bread was, and, you know.
Yeah, so the Greek says 200 denarii, that's what it says, not half a year's wages, but it's like. That's buying out all the bread stores in town with all the bread they've got.
Yes, sir.
This is COVID-19 levels of bread purchasing.
I mean, we don't feed 5,000 every Tuesday, but we feed 15 people, and there's sometimes when we're not, we're going, this gonna be enough.
Pull out those chicken nuggets.
Gotta pull out the chicken nuggets.
Put one more container of chicken broth on the chicken noodles,
Yeah.
because we need this to go just a little bit further.
You can't imagine how, if you're looking at 5,000 people, and we gotta remember that they just counted the men, they didn't count everybody, so there could have been 7,000 or 8,000 people, you know?
When I told,
Just 5,000 would be dead, I mean, that would be humongous.
when we were in Tell City and I preached a sermon on, not Mark's version, I think it was Matthew's version of the story. I said, you know, realistically, Perry County, where Tell City was at, was 19,000 people. With 5,000 men, if they all brought their spouse and their kids, it could have easily have been 19,000 people.
Yeah.
We don't know. It's enough that here in a little bit, it does say And they sat down in hundreds and fifties.
Yeah,
You know, we started counting everybody off out in hundreds and realized, oh, this still isn't gonna get us. Let's count some fifties, some hundreds, and we'll just get there.
Sam,
Yes, Dennis.
the disciples were just returning from being out 2 by 2 and being commanded not to take anything with them, with the exception of their staff.
Yep,
So they had nothing.
right. They in and of themselves had nothing. Now the ministry's pantry, as we're gonna see, it will have 5 loaves and 2 fish. But yes, you're right. I mean, we don't want to diminish this fact. Putting it in context reminds us, they haven't even had a chance to go buy their provisions after coming back from the last mission.
what do you think went through their mind when did you give something? And they knew they had nothing to give, I mean, it was like. They must have had some money somewhere.
It's, you know. I almost get the picture, I remember when our boys were in high school. And, you know, they come up to you and they're like, I can't figure this out, and they're like, you got this, you go figure it out, and they're like, fine, I don't know how it's gonna work, but we'll do it. You know, that kind of attitude of, I already told you I couldn't do this. Now you're telling me to do it anyway, and you're not gonna help me, so I guess I'll figure something out. You know, there's almost that kind of attitude about the disciples you could read into this, you know. Jesus, we just got back, we haven't even had a chance to restock, and now you're saying, take what we got? Hey, here's 2 loaves and some fish, you know?
The statement's almost sarcastic, right? Well,
Yeah.
sure, we'll just go take 2,000 denarii, go buy some bread, you know, like, we don't have that, you know, I mean, what are you asking us, you know?
Well, you know, and I hadn't thought about even that part of it. We'll take half year's wages, 200 denarii. They probably never had 200 denarii in the account, in their bags to begin with.
Cause again, he told them, don't take any money with you, so it's not like they had coins in their pockets.
But wasn't it a faith thing though, that they had to rely that, you know, Jesus told them to do this, he's told them, you know, leave everything, go, follow me, blah, blah, blah. It's a faith thing,
Well, he,
you know, it's, you know, they don't know where the food's coming from, and it came from 2 loaves and fishes and blah, 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 but it's like, it's a faith thing, you gotta have faith that it's gonna happen.
well, they're working on that.
And that's exactly it, because in Mark chapter 6, at the very beginning, he's in his hometown. And he can't do very much there because they don't have the faith. He sends out his disciples and they do miraculous things because they have faith. We have the story of John the Baptist beheading to remind us that this is it. Jesus is the last one. It's either Jesus, or you might as well just let go of Yahweh and worship of God altogether and just, let's go be Romans, we'll go be Greeks, we'll be Norse, whatever. We'll figure some other God out, because it's either this or nothing. They have nothing left in the tank, they're there to report, and Jesus says, feed them.
Yeah.
And I can almost get the picture of them going. Oh,
But if they hadn't have been fed, how much of the information that was getting ready to be taught would have been taken in? Cause I'm sorry, if I'm hungry and you're gonna teach me something, it's not gonna happen till I eat.
which is why I think what Jesus taught the people who were there is not important. I think the teaching is about the disciples. Because that next thing is, how many loaves do you have? And he asked, go and see.
Like, almost like he knew.
When they found out, they said, 5. We have 5 loaves, 5 of them, Jesus, 5. Can you count? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I guess we have a couple of fish. That might be my lunch. You know, you can almost get Peter if he's the one who's saying it. This is my lunch. I'm not for sure where John's getting his lunch at. Who knows about Matthew, let alone everybody else?
But we know that in other gospels, the little boys are.
Yes. In the other gospels, they tell that story, it's the little boy's lunch, but in this one, there's a sense in which the absurdity of this interaction between the disciples and Jesus about the situation in front of them, from a human perspective, are the disciples wrong in this?
Well, again, it could be another sarcastic remark. Hey, we got 5 loaves, 2 fish. What are you gonna do with that? You know, I mean, basically, they're saying we need to send them away, you know?
Basically, what they're saying is, we can't do this.
But there's really no sarcasm there.
Well, oh, yeah. I think.
Where do you think the word sarcasm comes from? And I think that that's the point. You know, from a faith perspective, they just cast out demons. They just did the miraculous at the beginning of this chapter. Jesus told them to go do that. But when they're faced with what is a very real and regular temporal problem, they can't connect the faith response with the reality.
Kind of reminds me of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You know, so he challenges the prophets about how many are there? There's a lot more of them than him. And he's not even afraid to say, we're gonna do our sacrifice, you try yours first, and then we're doing ours. And then right after this great miracle where God burns it all up, Jezebel, one woman says, I'm gonna kill that man, and he takes off running. You know,
900 prophets of Baal and Ashdod, and he takes them all on. And God does the miraculous. And then the one woman. This is almost the exact opposite. And yet, the part of the reality is sometimes we can be so filled with faith in one moment. And the very real cares and concerns of this life in the very next moment can cause us to miss God's reality. And in Mark's gospel, it's not really an indictment of the disciples. It's just showing that they don't see it yet. They don't realize the scope of just what Jesus is willing and able to do.
And this is a new miracle, because now we're talking about taking a small amount of food and feeding 5,000 people. So what they dealt with, Jesus has already done, right? I mean, everything they did as Jews, Jesus was already doing, right? So now they come back out and they're all excited about that. And now there's this new daunting challenge, you know? All these people, I mean, 5,000 people, you know, have you ever been to a ball game, right? I mean, you can get lost in the crowd, really. Yeah, I mean, it's just sometimes crowds are so daunting that when you're challenged to do something, you're just a little bitty, you know?
Now, I want us to go back to Sunday school. Okay? And if I tell you, you have a bunch of people in a desolate place crying out for food in the wilderness, what's the next step? God provides manna. Right?
Yeah.
We know this story, right? Bunch of people, desolate place, crying out for food. What's God do?
Provide manna.
He provides manna. He provides bread. When they're crying out for food, what does he give them? He gives them spiritual food. He teaches them. But he doesn't just stop there, does he? And so we have this last paragraph. 39 through 44. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Now remember that Sunday school story I just put down as do you remember? I mean, when Moses couldn't handle the task, he was told to break the people up into hundreds and fifties?
Yeah.
Do you see the parallel?
Yeah.
Do you see the parallel? How many groups were there in the Old Testament Sunday school story? There were 12 tribes. And the priests took care of all of them. And you have here Jesus and his disciples bringing real manna, real bread, and caring for all of them and picking up 12 baskets. These were good Jewish people. You don't think they didn't see those parallels? This miracle, more than any miracle prior to it, is Jesus very visually telling them, I and the Father are one. The last time the people of Israel saw a miracle of this capacity was when God the Father was around them as a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. And he kept himself veiled in that miracle. And he is completely revealing himself in this miracle. So what do you think? Yeah, until Daniel pointed out those pieces, I had never linked the feeding of the 5,000 with God in the wilderness at the tabernacle, bringing the manna. But yet Jesus is very clearly doing it, right? He intentionally took them to a desolate place. In Exodus, he removed them from Egypt to a desolate wilderness, where all they could do is depend on him. The disciples are clearly trying to send the people back to Egypt. And Jesus says, what you got here is enough. More than enough. I did it before. I'm doing it now. I will do it again. Any thoughts?
Nobody went hungry.
Nobody went hungry.
I think that's important to remember.
And think of the manna story. The manna in and of itself was a provision, but it was also a test.
Yeah.
That if they took less than what they needed, God multiplied what they did pick up. If they took more than what was needed, God made that stuff rot, and there was new stuff the next morning. When the Sabbath came, they took 2 days worth. That stuff somehow didn't rot the second day. It was all about learning to depend upon God for what they needed. And in this moment, Jesus is telling them, will you depend upon me? As you said before, John, you get the story, which is powerful. You get the first layer just underneath that, which is amazing. You get the next layer down, and it's just like, wow. And Jesus is always playing not even 3D chess, he's like 4D chess, and he's 150 moves all the time. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he does it. And yet he's never condescending to his people. You know, he might get a little frustrated time again, but he never. But he doesn't treat them the way I treat people when I get frustrated.
Do you think maybe preparing the knife for the Eucharist? So that when he breaks that bread and said, this is my body, that we go back and remember how he satisfied the 5,000 with the 5 loaves, that his sacrifice is gonna be enough.
Oh,
That's beautiful.
I had never put it that way before, but the moment you started talking down that road, I'm like, you know that the disciples are like, you know, when they're walking to Gethsemane to go pray, they're talking about, do you remember when Jesus had the 5 loaves, we had the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he broke the bread and he made it more, and you know, and here he is, he changed Passover, the Passover lamb. And he fed us all.
Yeah.
And he's feeding us all.
Yeah, that's why I said earlier, and I don't take credit for that, Holy Spirit stuff, okay? Because I was just, the Spirit was speaking in my ear, but when I said everybody was satisfied, everybody got enough. You know, that sometimes I think people don't realize that Jesus' sacrifice is enough to take care of every sin you've ever committed. Do you understand that? There's nothing that God's holding against you now, except do you believe that Jesus died, and with that good enough?
And just like what you're saying, and just like in this story, Jesus' sacrifice isn't just enough for the people that's there, but there's leftovers.
Yeah.
And imagine if Jesus could feed 5,000 men plus everybody else with two fish and 5 loaves. And he ends up with 12 basketfuls left over.
I know, that's what's amazing.
Then imagine what he could do with those 12 basketfuls. That's the thing, it's almost a reverse math.
Yeah,
It's like when things are scarce for us, God not only can take care of the problem with our scarcity, but he can bring abundance out of our scarcity. Let's see if we can finish the chapters. We got about 22 minutes left. I'm gonna read the next pericope. It's 45 through 56. And then we'll come back and we'll read it section by section. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. They just got out of the boat. Now immediately get back into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida. This time we do get a location. I better stop. Read it. Just read it. While he dismissed the crowd, after leaving them, he went on a mountainside. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into the villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. So that's the whole rest of this story. But the first section says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on the mountainside to pray. So what do you notice?
He needed, I don't know,
He needed time alone, not just from the crowd, but from the crowd and his disciples. How long do you think it takes to dismiss 5,000 people?
depends on how much they want, you know. They want to stay, you want them to go, all that stuff, you know.
On Sunday morning between the services, if everybody is really in a hurry, I can get about 75 people out of that sanctuary in about 5 minutes. Now, if you do the math, that doesn't bode very well, does it? Like you said, most of these people are probably, I mean, they've been fed by Jesus. They didn't need to go into town. It's probably not going to be easy to get them to go. And once he's done with that, he gets time to himself with his Father. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, one thing I noticed was, I thought Gennesaret and Bethsaida were two completely different locations. Did they not go where they were told to go? Did they not land where they expected to land? I had not noticed before that they were sent to.
So Bethsaida is on the northeast part of the lake. Gennesaret is on the southeast part of the lake. And they were over on the west part of the lake. So he sees them struggling to go north. And they end up at the end of it south.
Yeah.
What else do you notice?
There's kind of a vision here. That little thing about Peter getting out of the boat and walking to him, I know we're not supposed to be talking about that, but
Well,
wouldn't you think Mark would have brought it up?
so here's the thing, and I've heard this before. This is one of the key reasons why people do think that Mark's gospel is Peter's story. Because in Matthew and Luke's telling of the story, it makes Peter look like he's a person of faith. Even in his moderate doubting and how he sinks in the water, he's the only one who got out of the boat. But if this is Peter's story that John Mark is writing down, and we're dealing with a humble Peter, right? We're dealing with a humble Peter who had to be reinstated by Jesus. You know, at the end of John's gospel, we get that story of him being told to feed my sheep, you know, and notice in verse 52, well, we're gonna get there here in a second, but it says, for they had not understood about the loaves.
Yes.
You know, this, you don't get the story of Peter crying out saying, Jesus, if that's you, call me out there too. Because if this is Peter's story, Peter now realizes it's not about him. And that story of him getting out of the boat isn't important. Because this is about the manna from heaven.
And if Peter's telling the story, you really don't want to say the bad parts where like you was thinking. So he probably would have avoided it altogether, right? So.
Any of this, I think that the humbled apostle Peter would not tell that story because it was too much about him.
You know,
Whereas for Matthew and Luke, whoever they were talking to is, you know, wherever Luke got his information from. He's like, no, that's too good of a story not to tell.
yeah,
And we know that Mark likes to get to the point, likes to be on a track, likes to introduce things in an important sequence. You know, so that
And so
kind of makes sense with in Mark's telling them this style.
in Mark's telling of this story, that part would be a distraction from the point that he's trying to make.
I think there's a whole lot to this story other than just Jesus walking on water. Because it says that he could see them. So if you look at Matt, let's say that here, Jim and Sarah here, they wouldn't be going deep into the water, so they'd probably go along the coastline. So Jesus could see, but they were struggling. The wind was against them. I mean, they were, if you know anything about rowing a boat, it's hard to go against current. And if the wind is blowing, it's even harder, and it almost keeps you from moving. I mean, you can row all you want, but the more you go forward, the more the wind's blowing you back, where you're almost stuck in the water, right? And it's like they're stuck in their faith. They can't go any further. They've got this far and they're stuck because all this stuff just coming out. I mean, let's be honest about it. 3 years is not very long. And Jesus is feeding them like, well, they're getting a drink of water out of a fire hydrant. They're not getting it from a spring, right?
Right.
And so all this stuff is coming at them and so they make these leaps, but then there's a point where they just get stuck because they just can't get what Jesus is teaching. And I think this is the whole point, you know. He recognized that they were stuck, and now he's going to give them an example of what he can do for them if they just have faith, right? And Susan's right, they're still learning their faith, you know, they're still learning the different levels.
They are absolutely still learning. And you know, as you were telling that story, the image that came to my mind is Paul in the book of Acts. He wants to go over here. He keeps trying to go over here.
Yeah.
And he says very clearly, but the Spirit wouldn't let me. He
Yeah,
didn't let me, he didn't tell me what else to do, but he wouldn't let me do this. And this is what I want to do. And then I had the vision. So when they are straining to make something happen, interestingly enough, Jesus says, okay, you know what, you guys are straining, this is hard, I get it. Let's go back where it's easy. Would they have thought that Gennesaret was where it was easy? You remember what happened the last time we went to Gennesaret?
And that's the other thing, to amaze that not people running from all the towns that wouldn't be with them.
The last time they were at Gennesaret, they were on shore for about as long as they were on shore with this story we just left at, right? They went to a desk, Jesus said, let's hop in a boat, so you can get away and you can rest and you can eat. And then we get here and all these people are here, we do all this ministry, so like, okay, get back in the boat, guys, this isn't working, we're gonna do something else. Go to Bethsaida, and they're just rowing and not getting anywhere. And Jesus walks out to them and says, okay, we're gonna go over here instead. And they're like, do you think we're gonna deal with a couple more legion of demons this time? But instead
They
they
pretty
don't.
much threw us out there last time.
Yeah, they ran us out of town. We got rid of a couple thousand pigs and that's about as good as it got. But this time it's not that way, is it?
No.
In fact, this time it's the exact opposite. And where they probably expected a season of hard ministry again, after a season of hard ministry, after a season of hard ministry, they get the exact opposite.
It's interesting that he points out that after Christ got into the boat, they were astounded. Not because the wind ceased, but because they didn't understand about the bread. And then it goes on to say, because he hardened their hearts.
Then he climbed 51 and 52. Alright, well, we'll do 50,
Well, you know.
give me, go ahead.
If we look at, it says he went walking out on the sea, and he's walking on sea and would have passed him by. It's like, he wanted to see if they would notice. Almost, wouldn't you think? I mean. I don't know how close he is to the boat, but he was close enough that they could see it was him right away. They thought it was a ghost.
Isn't that another faith story?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, ye of little faith, get out of the boat, walk to me. Continue to, keep your eyes on me and you won't sink in that water.
But see, that's the difference in the stories in Matthew and Luke where Peter walks out on the water. They're dealing with a storm. And in this one, they're rowing against the wind.
Yeah.
It's painting a different picture. They are striving to accomplish what they think God wants. They were told to go over there, and they're using every bit of effort that they have. Every bit of effort that they have to row against the wind. And Jesus is walking on top of the water.
yeah.
And like, it's not even a thing. Like, it's not even water, it's just land.
So isn't he pointing that you need? I mean,
Yeah.
You need to call, you need to notice that it's, meaning that is gonna get you to the other side. I think it's important to understand when the minute he gets in the boat, the wind ceases. The trial ceases, I mean, immediately, it ceases, right?
Yep. And that's the thing. When we go back. When they are sent out, they're sent out in the power and authority of Christ, they believe, and they're successful. When they gather, they lose sight of Jesus, and they see the crowd, and they see all the other things, and they're not successful. When they trust Jesus and they give even what little they have, they're successful. When they set out on their own strength, they row against the wind and they're unsuccessful. When Jesus gets in the boat, it gets easy and they're successful. It's all about our proximity and reliance upon Jesus.
right.
And just to make the point, Mark says, like the woman with the bleeding disorder, remember that in the chapter before?
Yeah.
Mark says, and wherever they went, he went into the villages and towns or countryside. They placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. These people have faith. They get it. Jesus's disciples sometimes get it. And sometimes they completely miss the point. Because they're hard-hearted and they did not understand about the loaves. You go back into Exodus. God providing the manna was God's statement to the people of Israel. I will give you everything you need. And the manna didn't stop until he gave them the land and they ate from the fruit of the land.
Right.
And Jesus is saying to the disciples, I will give you everything that you need. You just have to trust me. And like the manna was a test, and like them pining for Egypt was a test, here the test is, are you going to try to do it on your own? Are you going to row against the waves? Or are you going to trust me?
Seems like maybe it went back to almost being too familiar. Because they ate the same food he ate, slept in the same way and places that he slept. It was,
We can get comfortable with a certain reality of the life with God. And it can become so comfortable that we fail to see that there's all this extra that's still there to the life with God.
what occurred to me is that is not the way that people with Jesus. They didn't have that comfort level. What they knew was this man could perform miracles. This man could do things that nobody has ever done before.
The sheep without a shepherd knew that they were hungry, knew that they were sick, and they did what it took to get what they needed. The disciples, like you said, they had become so comfortable and so familiar with Christ that they missed what was possible because of what was right in front of them.
And those sheep were coming towards him. And the disciples' response and solution was to go away from him to get food. Yeah, just the opposite for some reason. And you would think they would be the ones that would notice it first and most, but I think that's a human characteristic.
You know, when the body gathers for worship, you know, there's a difference between going to church and truly worship. And I'm not talking about first service, second service, because it happens in both. There are some weeks, and it doesn't matter the church. Every church Melissa and I have served since I've been in ministry. I'm sure it's the same case with every church you serve. There are some weeks where you went to church and you came home from church. And it was okay. It was familiar, it was good. But then there are some weeks, there are some services where you go to church. And my goodness, it was amazing. And God shows up. Was God not there in the other services? No, he was there. He was there. We went through the motions. We handled it. We had our 5 loaves and we had our 2 fish and we were good. But the God is saying, when you follow me, when you truly follow me and trust me, and let me stay in your boat, I promise you will never worry again. You won't strain against the waves because you'll be in the center of my will. You won't be amazed because you will believe that I can do it. Oh, you might be amazed in that moment, but I can't tell you how many times in the last couple of years where it seems like Melissa and I have seen the miraculous in it. And at first I'm just like, wow. And then I'm like, well, that's not really wow. I mean, I've read the book. I know what God's capable of. I mean, I shouldn't really be surprised when he does what he says he's going to do, right? And so Mark, here we are, 6 chapters through. And he is thoroughly and completely telling his audience, telling us, Jesus is God. Jesus is godless. And when we do it Jesus's way, all we gotta do is just stand back and watch, because it's gonna be one heck of a ride. And when we don't understand, and when we're not enough, and when we don't have enough, just trust him. Because he's got it under control. Whether your daughter dies, whether your boat's being swamped, whether your lunch seems to just not be good enough, whether you're being sent to the place where you got run out of town. Doesn't matter the situation. Jesus has got it under control. And I love Mark's telling of the story for that reason. As the audience, when we read this, we are never given a doubt that Jesus has got it under control.
That Jesus is enough. I think that he closes it with this story about healing all these people. Now we're not focusing on the disciples, we're focusing on what Jesus does every time, right? I mean, it says that they brought them all over, carried them on beds, which was not very easy in that area. I mean,
And remember, this is the area of Gennesaret, right? This is the Decapolis. Are these Jews? No,
But probably not most of it.
most of them are not Jews. And what was it that God said back in Exodus? I have chosen you as my people, so that you will be a kingdom of priests to the nations, so that they will receive my bread as well. And Jesus just collected 12 baskets of bread. And they are getting it about the bread, and now they're amongst Gentiles, and the Gentiles are receiving it. If this was a movie, this might be one of those things where all of a sudden you get the really quick flashbacks, this scene, and then this scene, and then this scene, and then they're like, my goodness, why didn't we see this before?
How do we get those? With your insights and your insights and.
So final thoughts.
when you're up against the wall and you think that there's nothing you can do, turn your eyes on Jesus.
Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. And the things of earth will grow strangely dim. In the light of his glory and grace. That's great. Lord, we turn our eyes on you. Lord, we're amazed at what you do in us. We're amazed at what you do through us. Lord, sometimes we're amazed at the problems you put before us. But Lord, none of them are too big for you. May we never lose sight of you. Lord, may we live lives that truly glorify you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Just a reminder, I will not be here next week. So we got prayer gathering, so we will meet, and in 2 weeks, we will. 2 weeks is Ash Wednesday, isn't it? Yes. So I guess we won't be meeting for the next 2 weeks. Ash Wednesday, we're joining together with Kokomo Zion and Hillsdale. Zion is hosting this year. I'll be preaching. And if you can't make it out to the service at 6:30, we'll have our self-guided Ash Wednesday, in the sanctuary throughout the day, so. I appreciate you all, and, we'll gather again to look at Mark chapter 7 in 3 weeks.
It's good.
I'm sorry I missed last week, but.